we have two sets of quotations, each one on a set of index cards. I'll be distributing one set to one half of the room, and William will be distributing the other set to the other half of the room. And the exercise is for those of you who are on this half of the room to read your quotation out loud. We being Episcopalians can keep good order, I'm sure. We don't need to count off or anything. And the trick is for those on this side who have these readings, which we will identify in the course of the morning, if the reading on your index card seems to be a close parallel to what you just heard, then be so good as to share that out loud. So understand the exercise? Someone will read a card from this set, someone will note the parallel and read it out loud, and we'll all be listening to that. So, young sir, may I give this to you and you'll distribute it to the people on your side, because I'm tethered. The yoke of the law.
Except for our safety.
I believe that the purpose of the exercise will become really clear in just a couple of minutes. While we're doing that, there is one important point that we can establish. When did Thomas Jefferson live? 1700s to 1800s is good enough.
Okay.
So, does anyone ever listen to Clay Jenkinson's The Jefferson Hour? Okay. You've heard Jenkinson the scholar, not the Thomas Jefferson interpreter, discussing Jefferson's attitudes towards race. Have you heard that? Okay. Is that different than scholars presenting Jefferson, let's say in the early 1900s, would have said Jefferson's attitudes on race?
Well, we don't know.
Who were the early, was it Dumas Malone? I forget. Whoever did the Jefferson biographies a long time ago. They tended not to be as frank as contemporary authors are. Now, did Jefferson change in the years since his death in 1826? But the reception of Jefferson changed. Okay? So I want you to understand that when someone presents the thought of an earlier person, we are entitled to see what role does the present day of the presenter play in the presentation of the subject. So you with me on this? Okay, so now let us accept the scholarly consensus that Jesus of Nazareth died perhaps in the year 33 or perhaps in the year 30, but certainly about a full generation before the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. Okay? And the Gospels, as we have them, scholars basically say, are from about a half century later, a little less, a little more than a little more, but not contemporaneous. Very important things happened between the year 30 and the year 80. Very, very important things. So bear in mind that what someone said in the year 30, even if faithfully remembered, if our document remembering it is from 50 years later, we might expect to see some thumbprints of the later age. Do you understand that conceptually? Yes, sir.
What was the life expectancy for, like, I don't know, an educated person who knew how to write? Class, basically?
Does that mean mostly males?
Yeah.
Because women, unfortunately, died in childbirth very, very often. Very often. Well, when the Romans were decimating the population, the life expectancy was short. So the life expectancy, if you didn't get killed by the Romans in the years 66 to 70, if you didn't die of pneumonia in any winter, if you didn't die of a childhood disease, so someone who made it to 20 might make it to 50.
Okay.
Might.
Oh, dear.
And rarely more, of course. But, the idea that We lost Bach too soon. He was only 65. I feel that way passionately. but I don't think that anyone in the first century would have accepted that. Anyway, now we're ready for our exercise, okay?
All right, so quick disclaimer before we begin. Actually, let's do a quick refresh for those of you who are just walking in the room.
You know why?
This half of the room has some cards with some quotations on it. This half of the room has cards with other quotations on it. And we're going to have you on this side, somebody read one, and someone over here see if you have one that sounds similar. Now, the disclaimer is, in theory, this all works out, but maybe I picked something that didn't quite, I don't know. Let's just pretend it all works out. I think it'll be fine.
We do have a master sheet here just in case there was some error of transmission. Okay, I know it's very difficult for anyone to be the very first, so will you be the first man to jump into the undivided waters of the Red Sea so that they may now divide?
Whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven.
I happen to think that that's one which got lost in transmission.
Right off the bat, right off the bat.
Well, then let me give you one that I think is parallel to that.
Did you not bring that one?
I don't think I have it. Does anyone have on this side a card which begins, whoever sets aside any prescription? Okay, I think that's the one which fell out. Listen to this. Could you say that again, please, so that we hear it clearly?
It says, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven.
Okay. Be as heedful of a light precept as of a grave one, for you know not the reward for each precept. And similarly, run to do even a slight precept and flee from transgression, for precept draws precept in its train, and transgression, transgression. For the recompense of fulfilling a precept is a precept, and the recompense of a transgression is a transgression. Okay, well, thank you. Let's go on. Someone else.
The eye is the lamp of the body, so if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness.
Anyone have anything like that? What do you?
About eyes, but I'm not sure.
Let's hear what you got. The eyes have it.
Rabbi Tarfon, if one says, take the mote from your eye, he answers, take the beam from your own eye.
Oh, then let's run it in reverse. Let's run that in reverse. Does anyone have anything on this side about motes in the eye and beams in the eye?
Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own?
That seems to be a close parallel. Okay, good. So let's go on. Mary, do you have one?
Do not resist an evildoer, but if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also.
Do not resist yes, sir. What do you have?
If anyone strikes, he who is yielding, who ignores a slight or a wrong, has all his sins forgiven him.
He who is yielding, who ignores a slight or a wrong, has all his sins forgiven him. All right. Someone else.
Run it from this side.
Yeah,
we can go back and forth. Someone on this side have a good quote?
Resist not evil.
Resist not evil. Go on.
To such as curse me, let my soul be dumb. Yea, let my soul be undone.
To such as curse me, let my soul be dumb. Yea, let my soul be unto all as dust. Anyone have a resist not evil quote on this side? No?
Well, that sounds a bit like the one we just heard. Read the one we just heard again. Who just read?
Mary?
Do not resist an evildoer.
Oh, that's it. Bingo. We struck gold. Okay, so someone else?
If you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment.
If you are angry with a brother, you'll be in danger of divine judgment. Someone here?
I was just going to ask, If angry would be better translated as vengeful.
No.
Oh.
Good question, though.
Everyone who is angry with his brother shall be in danger of divine judgment.
Everyone angry with his brother shall be in danger of divine judgment. Do you have any more in that quote?
The angry man loses his learning, and all the divisions of hell rule over the angry man.
I like that one. All the divisions of hell, Gehinnom, rule over the angry man. That's a powerful one. All right.
How about someone on this side? Let's start over here this time.
Okay. I have one that starts out, you are blessed whenever men vilify you.
Right. Actually, that's a quote from another. But go right after that. Go right after that.
He who hears himself being cursed in silence is called a pious one. He who hears himself being cursed in silence, even though he could stop it, is called an ally of God. For nations revile him, and he keeps silence.
Okay. So someone who is vilified and keeps silent. Anything like that on this side of the room?
Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on any account.
Sounds pretty close.
Oh, good, we're partners.
So let's do 2 or 3 more because I think the purpose is becoming clear. Ma'am.
First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift.
Oh, I like that one. I know we have that one here. First be reconciled with your brother. Anyone have something like that?
Sins against one's neighbor cannot be forgiven or atoned by the Day of Atonement unless a man has first been reconciled to his brother, to his neighbor.
His neighbor. Sins, interpersonal sins, unlike sins where the offended party is God alone, are not capable of being atoned for on the Day of Atonement unless the sinner conciliates the victim first. That's the meaning of that. Okay, good parallel. And maybe 1 or 2 more.
You are the light of the world. The city built on a hill cannot be hid.
You are the light of the world. Goethe said, more light. You are the light of the world. I know we have it.
Just got to find it.
I have it here.
Oh, good.
You are the light of the world. Even as the dove brought light to the world, so do you, O Israel, bring light to the world.
So you are the light of the world refers to the disciples. I believe in the original context. You, O disciples, are the light of the world. And here, the same image is for Israel. Israel, you are the light of the world. All right, 1 more. How about someone on this half of the room? Anyone have a juicy quote?
Whoever has pity upon people will obtain pity from heaven. So long as you have pity on men, God will have pity on you.
Whoever has pity upon people will obtain pity from heaven. Please.
Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy.
Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Okay, we've had a half a dozen or so instances of parallels. Is someone able to tell us where the parallels come from? The 2 corpora of texts from which we're drawing our parallels?
New Testament on the right.
Okay, how about more specific, you guys over here? New Testament.
Any particular part of the New Testament? More specific. What part of the Gospels? Yes. How about geographically?
The Pauline.
Do you know?
The Pauline epistles?
No, we're into gospel.
Farther. Closer.
How about if we said Sermon on the Mount?
There you go. Sermon on the Mount. Has anyone taken a tour of the Galilee? Did they take you to the very mountain? There's something inspiring about that. The Sermon on the Mount. This may be a harder set to identify. Anyone want to hazard a guess where the quotations from this collection come from? Do you know?
I'm not entirely sure, but I'll take it. guess that there's some form of Talmudic commentary.
You're quite right. You're quite right. It's not one text only, but it's from the large corpus of rabbinic literature. Quite right. So, what would be your assessment of the degree of likeness? Slight, a lot, medium? What would you say? A lot. Is that surprising? No. Not surprising. Well, you're very enlightened.
Let me step in for a second. In all honesty, how many of you say, like, it's a little surprising? Anybody a little surprised? Nobody's even a little surprised?
Well, I'm married to someone who's Jewish, and I remember my sister saying the only thing, and I grew up Catholic, and my sister was saying the only thing that separates Catholics and Jews is Jesus. So, I mean, it's kind of...
because we have guilt in common.
The reason
well, would your grandmother have said that?
I doubt it.
Right.
She would have laughed, though.
And how about her grandmother? Or that's too far. No, your grandma's grandma, or that's time out of mind.
The reason I ask, it's fascinating to me that for this group, it's not a surprise to hear so much parallel. So I think for broader Christianity in the United States, it would be a surprise. Because in evangelical Christianity, which makes up a large swath of American Christianity, there's this sense that Jesus is much more like us than anything else. There is this very sense that blonde hair, blue-eyed American Jesus is the Jesus of the Bible. So to see Jesus as a Jew and within the rabbinic tradition of sorts is something that New Testament scholarship today is trying to recover, because New Testament scholars today understand that it's something that has been lost in a lot of ways. So for you guys to say this isn't surprising is encouraging to me to see that level of grasping of who Jesus is.
Let's approach this iconographically. How many of you grew up worshiping in churches where there were stained glass windows? A fair number. Okay, a large number. Did those windows include any depictions of Jesus? Okay. Did he have, ash blonde hair, fashionably long, blue eyes? Did he look a little bit like the actor who portrays Thor? No, not in your church. What did he look like in your church? Yes?
Long brown hair and but a whiter face. I must admit that.
Kind of like a northern complexion. But by the way, there's a simple scientific explanation of the gradient of melanin in the skin. You may be aware of it scientifically. As humans lived farther and farther and farther away from the equator, the danger of skin cancer from ultraviolet rays becomes less, and the danger of vitamin D deficiency from not getting enough sunlight becomes more. So a process of natural selection explains more melanin in the skin of those who live in the lower latitudes and less melanin. Okay? Obviously, this has nothing to do with character or intelligence. So if Jesus was born at a lower latitude than London, right? A lower latitude than Boston, what's the likelihood of Jesus having the complexion of a Finn? That's the point.
We've got a couple of questions in here. Did you have, yes?
I had the comment that those of us who didn't grow up with stained glass windows did grow up with Solomon's Head of Christ, which was blonde, beautiful, and it was taught in every kindergarten class.
That's right.
And I think iconography is extremely important.
Sure, it sets It sets our thinking even before we have words for it.
Now, I'm not sure how many of you did any of you have the experience of going to the doctor's office or the dentist office and there was a like Bible storybook in there, or is that only something that happened to those of us in the Deep South? Okay. And I don't know, it was always the same Bible story book too, and it was, I mean, it looked like Susie sitting on the couch next to you there, really. I mean, it was all the little American kids and the white and everything. And so yeah, whether it's stained glass windows or Bible storybooks, we're used to seeing Jesus portrayed in our image. I mean, we even have you go up the stairs here, and have you seen the stained glass window up the stairs over here? Mm-hmm. Right? Now there's a sense in which I get that. I'm not being critical of that, and we could go into that later. I'm just noting that for our purposes here, Jesus sounds very much like these rabbis because he was a Jew, right? Yes, sir?
This is tangential, kind of tangential, but it's kind of interesting to watch iconography of the Buddha. As you proceed farther and farther east, he becomes less and less ascetic in appearance.
Well, that's a parallel phenomenon. And to make it even sharper, the iconography of the Buddha goes from no depiction at all, other than footsteps or a parasol, to a depiction of a human figure once the development of the Great Silk Road helps to bring Hellenistic culture into contact with South Asian culture. And a tradition of anthropomorphic depiction of religious, even deities or close to deities, that tradition begins to influence the Buddhist practice of how to give visual interpretation of the Buddha. So the parallel is even stronger than you think.
This is about Buddha again. How did the Buddha, become such a fat little thing? Because I would consider, one would think the middle way.
Yeah, the middle way is not the sensualist. It's not the ascetic, but it's not the sensualist either. So that's a matter of acculturation. But you're right, it does take us far afield. I think we're ready to distribute our guides now. So it's a thick packet you're getting today. The first 3 pages, double-sided, you can simply put on the bottom and go to the last 2 pages. Because the first 3 pages are the complete set of parallels that we've been exploring so that everyone has the whole set. I think we've established how abundant are the parallels between the sayings of Jesus as preserved and interpreted, both of those are important, in late first century Christian community, and the sayings of the rabbis. And as William has said, it's not too far afield for us to say that Jesus sounds like a rabbi, albeit a rabbi with a very different bottom line than most of his contemporaries. Before we get into the scholarly parsing of what this means, I want to point out that there's a value in this that goes beyond scholarly enlightenment. The great German Jewish theologian Leo Beck, B-A-E-C-K, wrote a very illuminating essay, I think in the 1920s or maybe even the early 1930s, about the preservation of Jewish ideas within church dogmatics. A fascinating essay. He points out that there's a consistent and chilling association within Christian theology. Those who were anti-Semites wanted to minimize the Hebrew Testament's role in Christianity, and they wanted to minimize any consciousness of the Jewishness of Jesus. Conversely, those who have a philo-Semitic, not an anti-Semitic orientation, are willing to present Jesus as a Jew. And a very fine example of that is the conciliar statement from 1965 of the Roman Catholic Vatican II Council on the relationship of the Roman Catholic Church and non-Christian religions. So let me read that to you. as this sacred synod probes the mystery of the church, it remembers the spiritual bond that ties the people of the new covenant to the stock of Abraham. Thus, the church acknowledges, and now there's a quotation from the epistle to the Romans, that from them, meaning the biological children of Abraham, is the Christ according to the flesh. Furthermore, she, meaning this sacred synod, recalls that the apostles, the church's foundation stones and pillars, quoting or paraphrasing Galatians, sprang from the Jewish people, as did most of the early disciples who proclaimed Christ's gospel to the world. So the Vatican II Council, which was very concerned with opening a window to the world, as part of that process wanted to rethink fundamentally the relationship of their own faith community with other faith communities. And they started off with non-Roman Catholic Christian communities, other communions, and then they went to non-Christian religions as well. It's a landmark, and really it's a sea change, if not a landmark. Now, to bring this back to our own semester focus on wisdom traditions, what we've seen until now fits into the broad category of Torah, which is to say teaching what God wants you to know so that you may live by it. We've seen that starting in the book of Proverbs, but even more so in the literature after the conclusion of the Hebrew Testament, what we call the intertestamental writings, there was more and more of an association of wisdom with the Torah. And then we saw that there was also a thought of, well, how does one interpret the Torah? And this too is part of wisdom. So this gets us now squarely into the 1st century. So we need to ask ourselves the question, what is the status of the Torah if the Messiah has come? And here, before we answer that, we need to remember that although the New Testament comes packaged in one volume, it's not one book. It's a library. It's a library that contains some notably different perspectives, but that it's quite natural to want to harmonize those perspectives. If I'm teaching Sunday school, I don't want my primary school students to be focused on the in-house debates. I want them to hear, what is the message, bottom line? And in general, who likes to see mommy and daddy fighting? Right? It's not congenial. So we're going to talk much more about this in 2 weeks. But for now, I'm just going to foreshadow the answer that we're going to look at in 2 weeks' time. The year 70 was a watershed. We were talking about this before. The Romans suppressed the Jewish revolt that had broken out in the year 66. They suppressed it in a most bloody fashion. And the Jewish community of Judea was decimated. What we find after the year 70 is that Jewish communities are not thriving there at all, but rather they go back to the Galilee, and they go further to what we call today the Golan. That was a major center of Jewish life on the heights over the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, and in the valleys of the Galilee as well. Similarly, the Jewish Christian community decimated. So when you add that catastrophe to the gains within the new faith community, largely as a result of the missionary activity of St. Paul, an apostle to the Gentiles. Gentiles is a Latin word. It's the plural of gens. It means nations. In other words, not the Jewish nation, but all the other nations. That's what gentiles means. So Paul is the apostle to the nations. These are people who were kind of attracted to Judaism. Eternal life? Sounds like a good deal. So what's the admission price? Circumcision. That's a disincentive. No shrimp. A smaller disincentive. But still a disincentive, right? The ritual laws. And now circumcision, if you're 8 days old, you don't remember it. But if you're an adult contemplating the operation without anesthesia, well, isn't there some way I could, maybe be on the margins of the synagogue and still absorb enough of the message? So it was to them that the teaching of Paul was so appealing. So by the end of the first century, by the last decade, say the last third of the first Christian century, the church has become predominantly non-Jewish, predominantly Gentile. That means that the understanding even of the Gospels that we routinely present in Sunday school is conditioned by the way in which Gentile Christians came to read the Gospels. And that could be different, in fact is different, than the way the gospel, the way the message later codified in the Gospels would have been heard in the Galilee in the 20s or 30s. Because the Galilee, circa the year 30, was a very different place than Rome or Antioch or Greece or Asia Minor a half century later. Different people, different expectations. So what we're doing in a sense is recovering a way of understanding the Synoptic Gospels without the lens, corrective lens, of looking at it through the epistles of Paul. None of this is meant to be any disrespect to Paul, but it's a way of taking the varnish off so you can see the original luster of the furniture. So what we're doing right now is stripping varnish, just to give you a homey thought about it. Okay, so what of the law? And we're answering this question without our Pauline habits of thought. Pauline habits of thought tell us, well, the ethical law, of course. The ceremonial law, that's for Jews. By the way, it still is for Jews, but not for us. So we're acknowledging that, we're setting it aside, and we're asking ourselves, what of the law, if we frame the question in terms of the first half of the first century in Galilee, or in Judea, perhaps? Now, here, as the exercise showed us, the question can be profitably pursued by looking at Jewish parallels. I will tell you, the parallels are less perfect than our exercise suggested for a simple reason. Rabbinic literature, like Christian literature, developed over time and reached the literary form that we have over time. As it happens, the great codifying movement gets going after the year 70, precisely because after the destruction, there was this sense of the need to consolidate. Did anyone ever read T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland? Remember, at one point, after all these quotations from the great classics, he says, "These fragments have I shored up against my ruin." There's this sense after the year 70 that among the rabbis that we must consolidate, we must preserve, we must pull together what had been relying upon strictly oral transmission beforehand. So the rabbinic literature that we have is more closely parallel, the first rabbinic literature, is more closely parallel to the Gospels than to the generation of Jesus. So the parallels are close, but not perfect. Let's just be aware of that. But the question to which we return is, what of the law of God when the Messiah comes? If we look closely, we see that Jesus is not differing from other Jews in the statement that the law of God is still God's will for how you should live your life. What he's differing in is how to interpret that law. He's not saying, well, you know, the law is for old-fashioned people, not for us living in the age that we do. He's saying you have to interpret it differently. And that's what sets him apart from the emerging rabbinic movement. Let me walk you through a couple of quotations from a very fine book. I'll distribute this afterwards. The great New Testament scholar W.D. Davies wrote a book called The Setting of the Sermon on the Mount. It's about 50 years old. Very, very fine work of scholarship. So I'm going to share with you a few of his quotations. This is on page 2 of the study guide. Matthew was conscious, the author of the Gospel of Matthew, was conscious, as were other early Christians, of living in the Messianic age. The role of the law, therefore, inevitably occupied him. For him, the Christian dispensation denies the old law on one level, but affirms and fulfills it on another. This is the meaning of the Sermon on the Mount. The substance of a new Messianic Torah is clearly present to his mind. So we have to understand what that means. Denies on one level, affirms and fulfills on another level. Well, understand that the process of making the law more readily digestible, making it the guideline for life, was exceedingly urgent in Judaism after 70, precisely because the central institution of the religion had just been destroyed. The temple was no more. The authority of the priests, therefore, lacked that which had sustained it for a full millennium. What could replace that if the Jewish people were not simply to evaporate? So the rabbinic answer is that the synagogue can replace the temple. Study and practice can replace the biblically sanctioned cult of serving God. So study and practice means study of the Torah. I mean, they're not studying Euclid, although some of them knew it. Some of them were famous as astronomers, but that's not their core curriculum. Their core curriculum is Torah. And applying it means applying it to all the situations of life. And the situations of life in the first Christian century were quite different than the situations of life in the Bronze Age. The Greco-Roman world was a much more commercial world than the world of King David. The Lord is my shepherd is a poem that makes sense when shepherding is the characteristic occupation of the people who are listening to that poem. The rabbis don't write the Lord is my shepherd because they live in a different world. They love that poem as we love that poem, but they didn't originate it. So the work of the rabbis was to make Judaism speak to the life that their communities were living. Old wine in new bottles. You're familiar with the phrase. So Jesus, as presented by Matthew, gives us a counterpart to that, gives us perhaps a response to that. One good way of seeing the response is considering the Lord's Prayer. You familiar with the Lord's Prayer? You probably recite it now and again. So, how long is the Lord's Prayer? About a paragraph. Is there anything in the Hebrew Testament that tells you to give a one-paragraph prayer on a daily basis? Nope. What you do have is a requirement to affirm your love of God night and day. This is not Cole Porter's night and day. Right? Deuteronomy chapter 6. You shall speak of the love of God when you lie down and when you rise up, which the rabbis interpreted to mean read that paragraph at night and by day. But you don't have in the Hebrew Testament formulate a prayer that encapsulates the main concerns of the faithful and recite it on a regular basis. In other words, what you don't have is the beginnings of a fixed liturgy apart from animal sacrifice or grain sacrifice or wine libation. You have it in the Lord's Prayer. Strikingly, you have it in the same decade as the work of Matthew in the Rabbinic Synod in the Mediterranean coastal town of Yamnia. In Hebrew it's called Yavne, and that's how I'll be referring to it, Yavne. In Yavne, they created something called the 18 benedictions. This is still the core of Jewish worship to this day. So each benediction is a paragraph concluding with a benediction. Blessed are you, O Lord, who endows the mind with reason. Blessed are you, O Lord, who delights in repentance. Blessed are you, O Lord, Redeemer of Israel, and so on and so forth. There's a total of 18 of them. 3 of praise, and then about a dozen of petition, and then some of thankfulness. And then the rabbis say, if you don't have time for that, you can do the Reader's Digest version. This is called the abbreviated 18. The abbreviated 18 takes the themes of those 18 prayers and puts them into a couple of sentences. That is, in concept, if not in exact wording, what's happening in the Lord's Prayer. When you're going to pray, here's about a paragraph of what you should be saying on an ongoing basis. And in fact, there are many specific parallels as well. Now, the requirement to worship in sanctioned words at a regular recurring time is a law. It's something that, from that point of view, you need to be doing. So we see that there's a common thrust here. Now, Davies says something that I think is very astute. He says, speaking as a modern Protestant to a modern Protestant audience, he says, both as Jew and as Messiah, the category of law was not alien to Jesus as it is to us modern Protestants, but native and congenial. That's an important sentence to reflect upon, especially within a Protestant study circle, that thinking about law was not alien to him, because after all, Jesus comes before Paul. He's not thinking of his own words through a Pauline interpretive filter. So it's not at all surprising that he's the heir to a tradition that retains a positive sense when it thinks of law. It's just that he interprets it quite differently. Now, having spent a lot of time establishing relationship, I think it's only fair to spend a few minutes acknowledging the important differences that exist between Jesus' presentation of Torah and the rabbinic presentation of Torah. Do not be angry versus do not actually strike your neighbor, right? Do not look lustfully as opposed to don't drop your pants. Do not even go to the law court as opposed to follow established principles of equity when you bring suit. in each case we can see that there is, I'm going to use Davies' word, there's a sobriety in the rabbinic formulation of what God demands of you, and there is a, quote, extreme coloration of Christian ethical teaching. Jesus is demanding something astoundingly ambitious. So how are we to understand this? There are a couple of different ways of understanding this, and at this point I have to acknowledge that I don't have the only way of understanding this. I'm going to give you two thoughts on the subject, acknowledging that there are others as well. My first thought is that Jesus is speaking to his disciples. His disciples, if I can use a television analogy, his A-team. Now, I mean, this is the problem. How does a great charismatic leader extend the revolution beyond the personal horizons of whom he can meet? If he's going to commission, and that's an appropriate word with Matthew, if he's going to commission disciples to spread his word, then they have to be a particular sort of person. They can't be ordinary. They have to be extraordinary if they're going to convey this extraordinary vision. So my first understanding of the extremism in the Torah of the Sermon on the Mount is that Jesus is creating an A-team. It's a little bit like the U.S. military's distinction between the Army and the Marines, right? For the Marines, what's their advertising slogan, their recruiting slogan? The few, the proud, the Marines, right? And apparently they never have difficulty achieving their recruiting quotas. It's an interesting psychological observation. But they're looking for the few. So one way of understanding the high ambitiousness of don't even lust in your heart is that Jesus is creating an extraordinary team of disciples. That's one possibility. The other possibility has to do with the sense of where are we in history? And I want to give you an academic analogy. I have a recurring nightmare. Maybe you have recurring nightmares as well. I have a recurring nightmare that it's the day before the final exam, and I never bothered to go to class. And I forgot to withdraw during the drop ad period. So my only choices are F or WF, neither of which will assist me in trying to get into grad school. So, is it worth it for me to stay up all night, using, Jolt or whatever you use, so that I can cram and at least do a little bit better on the exam? It's worth it, right? To take extreme measures. On the other hand, if I have studied all semester long and never missed a class, the best thing I can do before the final is get a good night's sleep. You understand the difference? There are times when radical measures are the rational measures. And there are times when moderate measures are the rational measures. So now, if history is about to end, you've got a very time-limited offer to be with the sheep and not the goats. It makes sense to adopt radical means. If you've come to believe that only God knows when history will end, but we surmise that it's not likely to be soon, then you prescribe a different ethical teaching that people can follow in the long run. Or to switch metaphors, the speed that you need to muster for a sprint is much higher than the average speed that you need to muster for a marathon. It's higher even than the speed you need for your closing kick at the end of a marathon race. Rabbinic ethics is ethics for a marathon. Christian ethics, to me, looks like ethics for a sprint. But once we've said this, we can do something which I think is very comforting, and with this I want to conclude. Seeing that there are noteworthy differences, nonetheless allows us to see that the noteworthy differences are within an overarching relationship. So in a sense, we're closing the circle that we began at the beginning of our hour. The remembered words of Jesus set the emerging Christian community on its new direction. But within this new direction, the quest for wisdom, now identified with Jesus' own Torah, his own teaching, continued to inform the spiritual aspirations of the faithful. Just as the quest to understand and apply Torah wisdom remained a hallmark of Jewish life. P.S. We remain brothers and sisters.